something wriggling out of the shadow like a gray snake. Now it's another one, and another one, and another one. They look like tentacles to me. Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
HP Lovecraft is a pinnacle of horror and one of the most influential writers in modern literature. And despite his massive influence, Lovecraft's stories are notoriously almost impossible to adapt. And no one knows this better than Guillermo del Toro, who has spent almost 30 years now trying to make a big-budget Lovecraft movie that hasn't come out. And that's what we're here to talk about.
I think that any genre has a breadth and a width that you need to accept and explore.
Now, if you clicked on this video, you probably already know who these two are, but in case you don't, I'll give a brief summary. HP Lovecraft was an American writer in the early 1900s, and if you're familiar with his work at all, you probably know him as the creator of Cthulhu, but his stories have had a massive influence far beyond that one character. His style of horror was a radical difference from the gothic horror stories like Edgar Allan Poe's that were popular around that time. Lovecraft's horrors weren't obsessive killers or creepy birds and black cats. They were cosmic entities whose mere existence drove people who found out about them insane. To put it simply, the universe is a very big place. We know incredibly little about it, and some of the things that lurk in it would break your mind if you were to even see them. Lovecraft's stories were not popular when he was alive, and many of his most famous stories were only published after his death. But anyone who looks at horror today versus horror before Lovecraft can see the obvious influence he had. Some stories borrow a lot from Lovecraft, some a little, but both show just how much Lovecraft reinvented the wheel of horror literature. Guillermo del Toro is a Mexican filmmaker whose work is simply stunning. You might know him as the director of Pan's Labyrinth, The Shape of Water, Nightmare Alley, the stop-motion Pinocchio. His movies are great, but Del Toro is most known for his eccentric, otherworldly creatures. In terms of movie monsters, there is no one today that can even be compared to Del Toro, and few ever, frankly. Del Toro is the kind of guy that was making biblically accurate angels a decade before they were a meme. Before he was a director, he was a designer, and his films are living examples of just how far creature design can go. I'm a little bit of a fanboy if you can't tell. Now, in terms of making movies, Del Toro actually has quite a few projects on the back burner. A live-action adaptation of the manga Monster, an adaptation of Slaughterhouse-5, a Van Helsing movie, and a string of horror video games. And for a long time he was trying to make this movie, although some dork ended up making it instead. But Guillermo has been a fan of Lovecraft since he was a kid. He's such a big fan, he's got this life-size figure of Lovecraft in the library of one of his houses. And apparently a couple busts too. Of course the whole house looks like this, so it's not it's not as weird as you think it is. And the story that he considers Lovecraft's magnum opus, and the project that fills his mind more than any other by far, is At the Mountains of Madness. It's the story of an Antarctic research voyage gone horribly wrong as the scientists uncover creatures older than humanity trapped in the ice. Now, some articles on this topic say the project started in 2006 when Del Toro finished a version of the script he was proud of. But Del Toro says he's been working on this project since right after he finished his film Kronos back in 1992. Or at least a version of it anyway. It's quite different than the original story. It took place in 1500 South America instead of Antarctica, and followed Spanish conquistadors instead of scientists, who discover an ancient city under Aztec ruins. Of course, at this time, Del Toro's not a big name yet, so not much progress is made. Flash forward to 2006. Around this time, Del Toro's second big feature film, Pan's Labyrinth, had just won 3 Oscars, and the film before that was a decently big hit too. Del Toro's career is going swimmingly right now, and big enough to get him into talks with big studios about potentially adapting HP Lovecraft. But Lovecraft's stories are a bit of a headache to producers in Hollywood. Lovecraft stories don't have happy endings or even really happy themes throughout them. And sure, horror media typically doesn't have super happy themes, but Lovecraft's existential crises make that problem doubly so. They've often struggled to grasp mainstream audiences in the same way Edgar Allan Poe or Stephen King have. Think of Lovecraft like literature's Futurama. He means a great deal to a much smaller group of people. But that's not all. See, there's a fringe to Lovecraft's name that producers aren't unaware of. Lovecraft, even by the standards he lived in, was viciously racist and anti-Semitic, and any stories that got adapted would have to wash out a lot of themes of other things Lovecraft was scared of. The other big problem is adapting HP Lovecraft would not be low budget by any means. Producers usually love making horror films since they can be shot on a low budget and are known to return massive profits, and every demographic on Earth has an appetite for them. But Lovecraft stories of cosmic deities are described as just complicated to look at, and they're usually found on giant sets of twisted architecture. Guillermo del Toro himself said it would take about $200 million to make a movie he would be proud of. And given marketing budgets and whatnot, Universal estimates the film would have taken about $500 million at the box office to make a profit worthy of all the time it would take to make the movie. Del Toro was insisting on keeping it authentic to the original story too, which would almost certainly mean an R rating, another thing that usually signals lower profits. Making this movie would be a massive gamble, and Universal was uneasy about giving so much money to a shaky project. But a few more years of shopping the film around, another hit movie later, and Del Toro got James Cameron to sign on as producer to the project, who was ecstatic about it. Having a massive name like James Cameron on the project gave the movie a big level of legitimacy. Studios were starting to get interested, and around 2009 to 2010, the project was officially in some form of pre-production. Del Toro was making serious progress on Mountains of Madness at this time. There were even talks to have Tom Cruise as the main role of Professor Dyer. It was around this time he started making CGI tests like this. And this is just the one he's released. Just think about how many he's sitting on. But just because things were moving faster does not mean that Universal was 100% sold on the project. They did give Del Toro 8 months of pre-production time, and they were still loving the screenplay and the visual concepts, but they were apparently insistent on Guillermo to ensure that the film would be PG-13, something they argued about over and over, as he says. Del Toro says his insistence on an R rating is not so much that he's expecting it to be rated R or that he wants it to be uber bloody, but that he's been burned before on projects that he thought for sure would be PG-13 safe, and then got slapped with an R rating because the films were too intense. And I didn't even know they could give something an R for being too intense. Did anyone else know they could do that? Did anyone know the MPAA can just use whatever the hell it wants?
So I was in the editing room, and I got a call from my producer, and he said, "We have some bad news. You got an NC-17." And I was like, "That's great." Because I thought, oh, NC-17, all the films that I love have it, They were like, "Oh, that used to be an X." They were like, "No, that's not good." And I was like, "Well, why?" And they said, "Well, because the studio won't release your movie if it has an NC-17. I was so floored to have worked so hard against all the obstacles of no money and all the obstacles of people saying, "You can't make a movie like this, it doesn't make sense," getting the audiences to love it at that point, and then to have this unknown board that was apparently doing it for the filmmaker, right, because that's kind of the whole mantra, saying that I couldn't have my meaning. It was like being shut out from a system where, it was like, wait, let me talk to you. This isn't right.
Del Toro says he's not concerned with whether or not his film is bloody and crass or not, but if he can't make it as intense as he wants, he'd rather not make the film at all.
I love the image of the genre, but I'm not interested in the mechanics.
I don't know what you mean.
I'm not interested in the scares, but I'm interested in the atmosphere.
Universal said fair enough and showed Guillermo the door. And they had been probably planning this for a while anyway. Guillermo says they were also getting scared that the movie was looking too much like Prometheus, which was another upcoming movie at the time being distributed by 20th Century Fox. Del Toro has received counteroffers since then from other studios, but always with less money than he says he needs, and the real deal breaker for him, a mandatory PG-13 rating. Del Toro has moved on to other projects, but every time one of his movies are a hit, he goes back to major studios to pitch the same movie over and over again.
I've seen it come up a lot on social media in relation to your name. And that is, with the ongoing relationship you have with Netflix, do you think there's any chance that you might loop back around to At the Mountains of Madness at some point?
Well, listen, that was take a wild guess which were the first projects I presented,
Since then, Mountains of Madness has gained a bit of a cult following. There's a reason I'm talking about it today. If there's an unfinished movie out there that people have heard of, it's probably this one. And while there is some hope to see it one day, others have doubts that a Lovecraft film would even work at all. This guy said a movie adaptation, in contrast, would find it challenging to create a similar impact because the audio-visual medium has to be more explicit and less abstract. And this is an argument I hear from a lot of people, that a book captures the imagination in ways that a film can't. I couldn't disagree more. Obviously, the power of Lovecraft's monsters comes from the reader's mind, but I don't see why that can't possibly translate to the screen. There are 1,000 examples of films that have made great uses of the less is more principle and have managed to leave huge amounts of the picture to be filled in by the audience's head. In Seven, the film never actually shows you the crimes happening, but you see the aftermath and you hear enough details that it paints a pretty good picture in your head. A much more powerful one than if they were to actually have shown you the crimes happening. One of the most powerful parts of Reservoir Dogs is that we never actually see the bank heist gone wrong. We're just left to our imaginations of how it went down. And even films where everything's being shown can still allude to so much more underneath the surface. Would anyone really argue that the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest movie is less effective or less abstract than the book, just because you're reading the subtle expressions on their faces and not having them read aloud to you? And as for horror films, there are already so many that are based around the terror of what you don't see rather than what you do. And many other movies and shows, even if they aren't based on Lovecraftian horror specifically, are still able to capture Lovecraftian themes pretty well. Hell, even video games and comics have had great examples of implementing Lovecraftian themes. So the idea that this is something unique to books and that movies can't be just as abstract is just wrong. It's not just wrong, it's arrogant. But regardless of how you feel it would work, Del Toro is still trying to this day to get this movie made. Recently, he said he started to see the possibilities of accomplishing Mountains of Madness as stop motion. This is probably after the success of Pinocchio he started thinking about this, but hey, a feature-length stop-motion Lovecraft? I can safely say we've never seen that before. And hey, if you do want some good Lovecraft adaptations, they are out there. Del Toro has said that this experience has taught him that God laughs when we make plans. But despite that, all these years later, he's still pushing for this movie. There is a lesson to be learned in this Herculean task. Guillermo del Toro is successful for this reason, that even though it's been 30 fucking years, he's still dedicated to this goal. Life doesn't always go 100% as we planned. Anyone who's experienced a little bit of life knows this. But what matters is that we still show up to the task every day.